Hello students, welcome back to this class. I'm Satvika and I'm still your lecturer for this class. And in this video, we still talk about the introduction part of psychopathology perspective, but more specifically, we will discuss about the integrative approach to psychopathology. All right, so in the last video, we already reviewed some traditional views of psychopathology, including the supernatural, biological, and psychological paradigms, right? And to continue our discussion, in this video, we will examine the specific components of multi-dimensional integrative approach to psychopathology. So first, we will evaluate the factors from the field of genetics and neuroscience. And the next we will evaluate the factors from the behavioral and cognitive processes, also the emotional influences to psychopathology, as well as the cultural, social, and interpersonal influences. And finally, we will also consider the developmental influences in any discussion of the causes of psychological disorders. So keep in your mind what we have confirmed in our previous videos, that no influence operate in isolation, right? So each dimension either is biological or psychological or social is strongly influenced by the others and by the development as well. And they weave together in various complex and intricate ways to create a mental disorder. All right, so a linear or the one-dimensional model is a model that attempts to trace the origins of behavior to a single cause. So these linear causal models may hold that, let's say, schizophrenia or phobia is caused by a chemical imbalance or by growing up in conflicted family, for example. So in psychology and psychopathology, we still encounter this type of thinking occasionally, unfortunately, but nowadays most scientists and clinicians believe that abnormal behavior result from multiple influences. Okay, so we should consider the interaction of all relevant dimensions to identify mental disorders here. This is what we called a multi-dimensional model. So, all right, first, let's take a look to the genetic contribution to psychopathology first. As you might still remember from your biopsychology class, that genes are long molecules of DNA at various locations on our chromosomes inside our cell's nucleus, right? And some of our characteristics are strongly determined by one or more genes, including our natural hair color or eye color. But what about our behavior and traits? Our likes or our dislikes? Do genes influence our personality and by extension our abnormal behavior? So behavioral geneticists have reached general conclusion that in the past, several years on the role of genes and psychological disorders is irrelevant to this discussion of integrative approaches to psychopathology. So as I noted earlier, it has become increasingly clear that genetic contribution cannot be studied in the absence of interaction with events in the environment, actually. That trigger genetic vulnerability or turn on specific genes. So the phenotypes and the genotypes combination occurs here. And further, the diathesis stress model here said that individuals inherit tendencies to express certain traits or behavior, which may then be activated only under condition of stress. So its inherited tendency is diathesis, which means literally a condition that makes someone susceptible or developing a disorder. And when the right kind of life events, such as a certain types of stressors, that will come, and then that will make the disorders develop. So for example, a patient inherited a tendency to faint at the sight of blood, for example, and this tendency is the diathesis or the vulnerability, okay? But it will not become prominent until certain environmental event occurred. For example, like the patient then seeing an animal being dissected, for example, when she was in a situation that she cannot escape. And these circumstances that activated her genetic tendency to faint, and those together, this factor then led to her developing a mental disorder of phobia. Okay, so you can see that diathesis is genetically based and the stress is environmental, but they must interact together to produce a disorder. All right. So specific genes or small group of genes may ultimately be found to be associated with certain psychological disorder, right? But as discussed earlier, much of the current evidence suggests that contribution to psychological disorders come from many genes, not a single genes, okay? And they like interact together. This is what we call like polygenic. And further, the reciprocal gene-environment model or the gene-environment correlation model is a complex interaction between genes and the environmental. It plays an important role of the development of mental disorder. So it's almost the same like the diathesis and stress model. According to the epigenetics theory, the immediate effects of the environment influence the cells, the DNA that turns certain gene on or off. And this effect may be passed down through several generations. All right, so moving to the next one, knowing how the nervous system and especially how the brain works is central to any understanding of our behavior, our emotion, and our cognitive processes. This is the focus of neuroscience, okay? So I believe you still remember that from your biopsychology class or cognitive psychology class that human nervous system includes in the central nervous system, and consisting of the brain and our spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system, yeah? And the brain uses an average of 100 billion nerve cells called neurons to control every thought, every action or our behavior. And neurons transmit information throughout our nervous system, communicate to each other through a synaptic cleft, and release chemical called neurotransmitter, yeah? I used to remember that. And as well as the endocrine system here, or the neuroendocrine activity, is closely related to immune system. It also implicated in a variety of disorders. So in addition to contributing to stress-related physical disorders, endocrine regulation may play a role in depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia as well. So from the perspective of neuroscience, many evidence suggests that psychological disorders are related to problems in the brain, such as Huntington disease, yeah? It's caused by gradual degeneration of parts of the basal ganglia, called the caudate nucleus and putamen. Yeah, also the brain chemistry research showed that abnormal activity in the neurotransmitter related to mental disorder. Sorry for the mistype there. It's not causing, but it's like contributing or associated. And also the genetic abnormalities may relate to disorders like schizophrenia, intellectual disorders, and Alzheimer's disease, for example. And another one is viral infection. Viral infection may play roles into the dysfunction of brain structure and brain biochemical, such as schizophrenia and mood disorders. There's some research about that also. And recent research indicates that COVID-19 viral infection might relate it to brain dysfunction too. So major findings from neuroscience field is the neurotransmitter relevant to psychopathology, the development of psychopathology, okay? Include norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, or the gamma aminobutyric acid, and the glutamate. So excesses or insufficiencies in some neurotransmitter are associated with different group of psychological disorders, yeah? So you can see some of the example here. However, increasing evidence indicates that this is an enormous oversimplification, okay? So we are now learning that the effects of neurotransmitter activity are less specific. Yeah, they often seems to be related to the way we process information. So changes in neurotransmitter activity may make people more or less likely to exhibit certain kind of behavior in certain situation without causing the behavior directly, okay? So in evidence, broad-based disturbances in our functioning are almost always associated with interaction in the various neurotransmitter rather than with alteration in the activity of any one system. All right, so moving to behavioral and cognitive science. So it is affect the learning and adaptation throughout our life and contribute psychological disorders as well. And it's also correlated with brain functioning and brain structure and genetic expression as well. So enormous progress has been made in understanding behavior and cognitive influences in psychopathology. All right, so some new information has come from the rapidly growing field of cognitive science, of course, nowadays. And the contribution of behavior and cognitive science are the cognitive conditioning and cognitive process that we have been reviewed in the previous video. And some of the new findings growing to a new theory related to behavioral and cognitive science. For example, here is the learned helplessness by Martin Seligman. So this condition occurs when from the experiments done by Seligman, right? When rats or other animals encounter condition over which they have no control on it. So for example, if a rat's confronted with a situation in which they receive occasional food shock, they can function well if they learn they can cope with the shock by doing something to avoid them. Say they pressing a lever. But if the animals learn their behavior has no effect on their environment, sometimes they get shocked and sometimes they don't, no matter what they do, they become helpless. In other words, they give up attempting to cope and seem to develop the animal equivalent of depression. And the next theory is the social learning. Yeah, so organisms do not have to experience certain events in their environment to learn effectively. Rather, they can learn just as much by observing what happens to someone else in a given situation. So this fairly obvious discovery came to be known as modeling or observational learning. And the next one is the prepared learning. It is through this theory, it is clear that biology and probably our genetic endowment influence what we learn, right? And this conclusion is based on the fact that we learn to fear some object more easily than others. So in other words, we learn fears and phobias selectively. So we have become highly prepared for learning about certain types of object or situation over the course of evolution because this knowledge contributes to the survival of the species. So it's happened to us too. Even though without any contact, for example, we are more likely to learn to fear snakes or spiders more than we are fearing rocks or flowers. Yeah, even though we know rationally that the snake or spider is harmless, for example. And the last one is the cognitive science and the unconscious theory or research in here. So scientists have also discovered that a great deal goes on inside our head of which we're not necessarily aware, right? So because technically these cognitive processes are unconscious. So this is shown by our implicit memory. So it can be selective for only certain events or some circumstances. It's not all our memory are implicit. And recently, cognitive neuroscience using brain imaging methods using fMRI have noticed differences in the processing of neural activity in the brain, depending on whether the person is aware of information or not. All right. And the next discussion is about the emotion perspective. So emotion here plays an enormous role of in our day-to-day lives and can contribute to major ways to see the development of mental disorders. So according to the emotion theory, emotion is composed of three related components, including behavior, physiological, and behavior, physiological, and cognition, but most emotion theories tend to concentrate on one component or another. And emotion theories who concentrate on behavior thinks that the basic patterns of emotion differ from one another in fundamental ways. For example, anger may differ from sadness, not only in how it feels, but also behaviorally and physiologically. So these theories also emphasize that emotion is a way of communicating between one member of the species and another. All right, so one function of fear is to motivate immediate and decisive action, such as running away. But if you look scared, your facial expression would quickly communicate the possibility of danger, right? to your friends who may not be aware that threat is imminent, for example. So your facial communication increases their chance to survival because they can know respond more quickly to threat when it occurs. So we now know that suppressing emotion, almost any kind of emotion such as anger or fear, will increases the sympathetic nervous system activity, which may contribute to psychopathology. So this emotional state, for example, like depression, yeah, then it's regulated by the sympathetic nervous system activity. So given the wealth of neurobiological and psychological variables impinging in our life, the studies are beginning to demonstrate the substantial power and depth of social and cultural influences as well. So for example, schizophrenia and major depressive disorders seem to occur in all culture, yeah, but they may look different from one culture to another because individual symptoms are strongly influenced by social and interpersonal context. Yeah, some of the social environmental influences include poverty, war, migration, gender, and etc. Also, we must consider such things called global incidence of mental disorder. So for example, here, the suicide phenomenon that becomes embedded in certain culture, thus we have to understand this disorder based on the culture behind them. All right, so mental disorders is also actually culture-bound syndrome, means that social cultural influences also define the form and the symptom of psychopathology that might sometimes different from the definition in the DSM-5, okay? So here are some example of culture-bound syndrome that you can read here in the slides. For example, in Indonesia and Malaysia, there is a amok, it's a violence, anger, aggressive behavior leading to persecution, murder, and followed by suicidal behavior by a person. And here you can see Latah, Koro, Windigo, Kitsuneki, and Taijin Kyofuso from several different cultures. All right, finally, we then should look at the psychological disorders from the developmental perspective as well. So think back on your life over the past few years. So the person you are here now is different from the person you were 3 years ago. So does you'll be in the next 3 years, okay? So you will change, okay? So the principle of equifinality say that different early experience in life can lead to similar outcome or the same psychological disorders, include parental divorce, physical abuse, and etc., right? And to understand psychopathology, we must appreciate how experiences during different periods of development might influence our vulnerability to other types of stress or to differing psychological disorder. All right, so we have examined modern approaches to psychopathology, and we have found the field to be complex indeed. And this brief overview, even though it may not seem too brief, we have seen the contribution from the psychoanalytic theory, behavioral and cognitive science, emotional influences, the social and cultural influences, genetics, neuroscience, lifespan development factors. So those all perspectives must be considered when we think about psychopathology, right? And that's all for the course in this video. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you again soon in the next class.